This strange, eventful history by Claire Messud is a family history project that perhaps should have been kept in the family. This novelisation of Claire Messud's French-Algerian ancestors begins in 1940, when the family are flung to separate sides of the Mediterranean, the father stuck in Greece by the rising tides of war. And then we jump forwards and forwards over the decades to 1950s Algeria, to 1960s America, to 1970s Brazil, as our family go separated and come back together again, moving from old world to new, and having new generations along the way. This book, to me, felt deeply self-indulgent. Beyond some really lovely sentences, there was not much on offer here. Each character was painted in the same shades of melancholy as to make them almost indistinguishable and really boring to read. I have a very strong aversion to self-pity, and these characters do not. And each of these characters was also handled with kid gloves in terms of their faults and foibles, in terms of their relationships with one another. I felt like there was no depth because we were based on real people. I do have to admit that I have less than a fondness for a disjointed generational family saga, but this one felt more disjointed than most. Each decade was unmoored from the time in which it was set, at times which felt like a purposeful avoidance of the elephant in the room, them being colonialists at one of the most violent points of colonialism's rupture, being a case in point, and at times which just made the whole book feel pointless. And then there were the weird diversions into predatory queer people and a very bizarre family secret that just left me confused. But honestly, for the most part during this book, I was incredibly bored. Orbital is a book that aimed for the moon and landed nowhere, really. Following 6 astronauts over the course of 1 Earth day and 16 sunrises as they orbit the Earth on the day that a new mission for the moon launches. And nothing happens. Now, I am not against a book where nothing happens. I have a lot of books that are in my favourites that other people say nothing happens in them, and I love them wholeheartedly. But I do want my books that are doing nothing to say something. Harvey aims for beautiful prose about the profound experience of viewing Earth from an astronaut's eye view. But she filled her prose with so many flashy redundancies as to sacrifice clarity. There were so many times where I had to reread to understand what was going on, because she just veered off into pop philosophy in a way that just did not speak to me. And she is aiming for wonder and awe and a sense of smallness in the face of the universe and how this minimises our earthbound problems. But she repeats them so often. She repeats these supposed profundities and does so with the minorest of alterations to the point that they become just fridge magnet aphorisms. And she points this fact out from the perspective of someone or other of her astronauts, that when seeking for words for this singular experience, one can only say what has already been said by an overeager fresher in a first-year astronomy course. But pointing it out doesn't negate the fact that you're doing it. Or the fact that the astronauts in this book had characteristics, but no personalities, no discernible differences. Overall, despite the fact that this book is a meagre 136 pages, it dragged on what felt like forever. And perhaps that was the point, because our astronaut's single day feels like 16, but it is not exactly what I'm looking for in a book. Set over the course of 7 bouts at an under-18s girls boxing championship in Reno, Nevada, Headshot's omniscient character breaks into the heads of each of these fighting girls, exploring their dreams and their obsessions, their journeys to this shabby, half-empty gym, both literal journeys and metaphorical, and on into their frankly very depressing futures laid out for almost every single one of them. Their stories are told in detached but punchy micro-paragraphs that mimic the hits that they receive in the boxing match in which they are currently engaged. There are strong points of this novel. The rhythmic and repetitive prose drives on with pace and vigour. What I did enjoy was the contrast between the depression and the drive that exists within this gym. These girls are the best 8 girls at something in this country. They are fighting in a gym where no one cares. There's a lot of meditations on what it means to be violent as a girl. I was drawn into the boxing matches initially. The first earlier phases, I picked a girl. I had someone I wanted to win. It really brought to life that feeling of sport. And the meditations on gender and violence that I wanted to be more interesting were quite thin. They weren't particularly interestingly explored. They did not hold up to the promise of the premise and couldn't sustain themselves even over a pacey, short novel. And there were also moments when our narrator, as I said, spins out into the lives of others. Sometimes that is interesting, sometimes it is not. And sometimes our narrator spins into these weird metaphorical ideas that felt like padding, to be perfectly honest. And ultimately, I feel like it had elements of a clever novel, but it didn't quite cohere. But it is a debut, so perhaps Bullwinkel will do better in the future. Playground follows 4 characters over the course of 60 years whose seemingly disparate stories weave together with AI, board games, neo-colonial doomsday prepping, and oceanography. A tech millionaire relives the days of playing Go and falling in platonic love with a boy from the wrong side of the tracks in Chicago. A French-Canadian pushes against patriarchy to explore the marine depths of the mid-century. A Pacific Island woman tells her daughter foundation myths and builds sculptures with the contents of a seabird's stomach. And the island's mayor grapples with the idea of whether to sell part of his island's freedom to sea-steading part of an island that was already ravaged with the extractivist phosphorus mining. So many complicated words in this review, and that is part of the thing of this book. One of the things that I think Powers does really well is he combines technical language with beautiful writing in a way that enhances rather than detracts. I'm not really a science girly, and I often find myself turning off when tech becomes mentioned in books, but his love of the natural world is contagious, and whilst he is overly fond of listing things in the natural world, he did make me want to turn on Blue Planet. Similarly, his descriptions of 2 boys platonically falling in love with each other over the board games chess and Go made me want to take up those games, even though I know I do not have the patience for them. So he is a good writer in terms of science, but this book is all over the place in terms of structure, and he is writing archetypes, not characters. His clumsy attempts at writing what it would be like to grow up as a black boy in 80s Chicago, it all feels a little heavy-handed. And whilst I sympathise with his cry for better treatment of a planet that he truly thinks is gorgeous, he was a little mawkish and overly sentimental in the way that he wrote it. And the rest of his politics reads fairly milquetoast. As I said, I am already bored of writing about AI. And ultimately, he doesn't really seem to be saying any more than any centrist dad with a column in the opinion pages of the Times. Creation Lake by Rachel Kushner is the book that I am having the hardest time reviewing out of any books on this list. It's the one that I feel the most kind of ambivalent about, I suppose. It's such a confusing mix. It's like an assault on the reader that doesn't let you rest. And I feel like our main character, Sexy Sadie, has come out and like slapped me in the brain. The book follows the grating, arrogant, and I think pretty shit at her job undercover agent whose nom de fuckery is Sadie Smith. And she has been sent by her mysterious employers to infiltrate this eco-agricultural group called the Moulinards, and to pin on them some eco-terrorism, and maybe entrap them into something else as well. As part of the job, she has hacked their emails, and the text is littered with emails of the group's absent mentor. A veteran of 68, enamoured of Neanderthals, and with the idea of returning to the literal underground and becoming a contemporary caveman. I started this novel rolling my eyes at the tone of the book. They're like modern, middle-class, millennial book that is everywhere. The Melissa Broder style navel gazing that I can really do without. But Creation Lake then turned weirder than any of those books. Our main character was unhinged in a way that I enjoyed much more than I do with the self-pitying. The philosophical musings and the satire of activism was splattered with these nonsensical characters, and I thought that it was strongest when it was taking to task every single character in the book. However, it seemed that Kushner kind of wanted to shoehorn in a plot to all this madness, and those two halves, those two things, the vibe and the plot, they never properly coalesced. And so it ended up being a book that I sort of really enjoyed and sort of still don't understand why it was written. The Safekeep by Yael van der Wouden is perhaps the most fun book on this list. Isabel lives alone in the house her family moved into during the Second World War, the house her mother died in. She is paranoid that everyone is stealing from her, suspicious of every new person she meets, including Eva, her fuckboy brother's new girlfriend, whom he moves into the family home he technically owns though doesn't live in, pushing Isabel's anxiety off a cliff. She's also very anxious in a very 1960s way about discovering her other brother and his boyfriend, and about the man who lives next door who is seemingly interested in her in a very this could go male violence-y kind of way. The Safekeep is written in accomplished prose littered with moments of real sumptuous beauty. Van der Wouden crafts a novel of slowly rising tension that you definitely feel as a reader. And you also feel the moments of this book that got sexy in a way that I wasn't quite expecting. Well, I was expecting it to go in the way that it went. I wasn't expecting it to get as sexy as it got. Didn't hate it. Van der Wouden does atmosphere really well. What she does less well is originality. There was supposed to be a secret in this book, a moment of reveal that I think was supposed to surprise the reader, but it was both so heavily foreshadowed and so frequently done in other books set in this era that the bigger surprise would be if any reader didn't see it coming. And the beats of this book felt drawn from other works that I have read from before. There was elements of Sarah Waters and elements of Anne Patchett, things that I recognise from things that I have read before. And while each moment was done with skill, there was nothing really new brought to the page. It was definitely a fun book, as I said, but one that I was surprised made it onto this list. A quotidian crime novel, Wild Houses follows several characters on the edge of the small town crime scene in County Mayo. We have Dev, who is a little strange and lives alone after his mother has died, leaving him the house. Alone until his two cousins drop off Doll English, a standard working class Irish boy who's the younger brother of the dealer who got him into this mess, because Doll has been kidnapped in order to recuperate what it is his brother knows. Flashing back and forth, we see Doll's girlfriend, who drives him around town and who seems more concerned about leaving this place than she does about anyone in it. Add into that lost fathers, haunting fathers, and a bit with a dog, and you have what is a very accomplished but not particularly interesting novel, or at least not particularly inventive. Written with the expected wry, dark humour and lyrical turn of phrase expected of an Irish writer, someone is described as having a face like a vandalised church, which is just delicious. This book hums with melancholy beauty and interesting meditations on working class Irish life. A refreshing perspective among the myriad of middle class meditations filling the lit fic world. The dialogue is sharp and spiky. The internal monologues of the characters, whilst at times almost dreary in their difficulty, are interestingly enough rendered to keep a reader's attention. And I, for one, am definitely going to be focusing my reading on more working class writers and working class perspectives, because I think there is just something sharper about the writing. But for all of those accomplished elements, this book was just an enjoyable novel, a solid workhorse of a book that didn't have the sparkly something that I expect from a prize winner or a prize nominee. And in terms of the plot, it had an ending that sagged like an old party balloon. Solid debut, and a writer whose work I will be following, but not one of my favourites on this list. I have not read Tommy Orange's debut There, the novel for which this is both prequel and sequel, expanding outwards in time from the powwow of that novel's plot, and tracing the roots and branches of the Red Feather family tree forward and backwards in time over the course of more than 100 years. So there will probably be some resonances that I have missed, some intricacies of plot, characterization, and relationships that I have not grasped because I have not read that book. But I do believe that this is also a book that stands enough on its own and gives you enough of an outline of that novel's plot that not having read it doesn't hinder you too greatly. I don't feel like I failed to understand what was going on, and so the misgivings that I know some people have of sequels being placed on prize shortlist or long lists, I don't think really applies here. Wandering Stars is a beautiful, angry novel. It begins with an author's note recapping at high speed the horrors that have been visited upon the indigenous people of North America by colonialism, and then pulls in close to characters who lived it through the Sand Creek Massacre, Fort Marion Prison, and the Carlisle Industrial Schools, and then on into inherited trauma, cycles of addiction, and intergenerational poverty. It is a fairly well-worn story, but told with an urgency that makes it as relevant as ever. Orange's writing is both stark and lyrical. There aren't any of the unnecessary flourishes that I have noticed in some of the other books on this long list, and you can tell definitely that he is a poet. Because of the attention paid to both the sounds and the rhythm of the sentences, lending to the book a music that is another one of the themes. Music as inheritance and as a language between people people who do not speak of their feelings. And I say people and not characters because I think that is how real they feel to me. And while for me the reading experience of this was not as smooth as it was with some of the others on the list, there was some friction in terms of the structure of the novel. Despite that, it is no less powerful. Poet Anne Michaels begins her fragmentary little novel Held in a battlefield in 1917. Cinematic shots of stark trees silhouetted against the snow juxtaposed with John. Injured and unable to move, his mind wandering from first meeting with his wife in a cosy pub back home to the dead boy soldier in his side-eye vision. Here we spiral out in time, slipping back and forth from the beginning of the century and up until just after the present. In chapters built with a series of prose poems, some more poem than prose, filtering through ideas of inherited trauma and domestic love stories. There were moments here that spoke to my heart, meditations on the smallness of devotion and the enormity of loss, rendered with such heart-bruising honesty. There are beautiful meditations on the inevitability of grief, that is a fact that comes to everyone, a moment that was between four men in a snowstorm, telling one another stories. That was so small but contained so much. On the heartache of losing someone when their duty takes them from you, whether that is due to conscription or because of a humanitarian effort. And vignettes of jumpers knitted as dog tags for sailors lost at sea. And ghostly spirits of grief reappearing in dark rooms were rendered beautifully. But there were moments that felt a little less secure, a little less of a reason for them to be included, a little less part of the novel, as if the writer had done some research, particularly on Marie Curie, and found themes that connected when the plot did not quite. And this, combined with the lightness of the prose, made it a book that was difficult to grasp. An ephemeral novel that reached in to touch something deep and then dispersed like mist. I really enjoy retellings of classic novels, and I have never read Mark Twain. All I knew of Huckleberry Finn before reading this book, I learned from The Simpsons. Twain is an icon of American letters whose work doesn't play quite so much over on this side of the pond. But from knowing Everett as an author, having read his last shortlisted book, I had some idea of what to expect. James follows our eponymous hero, an enslaved man in the American South on the eve of the Civil War, as circumstances and a fierce love for his people drive him out onto the knife edge of his world. James is known to the white people that surround him as Jim, and Everett lets us know from the beginning how much of a performance Jim really is. The code switching that James must do in order to survive. And this really is a book about performance. We fall in with con men and minstrel shows, people playing with who they are, their identities, their backgrounds, particularly when it comes to their racial identity. And that declared performance rubs up alongside disguise and the necessities of always acting for survival in a world where white people will kill you for setting even one toe wrong. Because underneath the witty, dark humour of the famed satirist Percival Everett, and the adventure always in the back of our mind because of the knowledge of the title of the book that this is riffing on, and because of the presence of Huck Finn himself always looking for said adventure, underneath all of that is violence. Horror and brutality is not hidden, it is not disguised, it is there on the surface, as it is for James throughout his everyday experience. Everett does not look away from that in the way that I can only assume that Twain did. The journey up and down the Mississippi is perilous. The world that James inhabits is a horror show. But Everett instills enough hope and enough humour and enough love to keep the whole thing afloat. Personally, I don't think I will ever read Twain. This book is enough. Enlightenment by Sarah Perry follows two members of a small, isolated, high-control religious group in small town Essex. Thomas and Grace, the former a middle-aged grey man who writes wide-ranging and beautiful articles for the local newspaper, and Grace, the young girl he took under his arm after her mother died, becoming a sort of godfather to this strictly fathered child. We follow them over the decades as Grace grows up, and Thomas too seems to be coming of age. And it is first Thomas and then Grace who become entangled in the mystery of the local big house and the 19th century astronomer who once lived there. In amongst this is ideas of sexuality and sex and what it means when you are a member of a small group like theirs. Perry is a beautiful writer. I've read two of her works before and loved one, The Essex Serpent, although I did not love Melmoth. What I like so much about her is the way that she is able to blend ideas of of religion and mythology and science. I think that the intersections of those three topics are so interesting. Perry likes to look at the fanaticism and blindness and hope brought about by belief in any of these three things. And her focus in on the psychology of and the tenderness of humans is something that I love so much. She writes such wonderfully flawed and beautifully endearing characters, all of them, characters doing their very best and not doing very well. This is a novel that hinges on coincidences, on homeless giants striding out of fields in nothing but red long johns and happening to speak the very language needed to decode a discovered secret diary. It is a book that contains giants of Essex and rings of tombstone, and if you are willing to fall into the seduction of belief and lay aside issues with coincidences, it is lovely. However, for me, towards the end, some of these coincidences strayed too close to the twee, and my inner cynic reared her head. It is a beautiful book, but one that didn't quite stick the landing. Stoneyard Devotional is a quiet, pensive novel. It follows a woman who I believe is unnamed, who has returned to the town where she grew up, where her parents are buried. And after several visits to a nunnery because of something that has gone on in her past, she ends up retreating there, despite being an admitted atheist. This nunnery is then beset by plagues, a plague of mice, bones returning, and someone turning up from our protagonist's past. All of that sounds like there could be a lot of plot, but there is barely anything happening in this. In fact, what it reminds me of most is My Name is Lucy Barton. It is a book where there is clearly something dark going on underneath it. Something sad has happened to our protagonist that caused her to withdraw from her job and from her family and end up here, somewhere where she does not belong. She is seeking sanctuary. And yet, as over the course of the novel, we uncover the fact that nowhere is sanctuary because you are wherever you go. Real simplicity to this writing. It is very stripped back, and I know some people don't like that, but it is something that I really, really enjoy. I think that it gets to the nub of the thing so well. We can feel the melancholy, the fear. There is definitely a sense of fear and anxiety that permeates through this book despite the simplicity, and there is violence, the death of these mice and of chickens. There is a bloody, gory horror that is underneath this seemingly quiet book. It is also a meditation on grief, something that seems to have been a theme of my reading this year. And in this book, so many people are grieving specific people, such as our main character's mother, but a sense of something lost and a sense of something being hidden continues, whether that is the Catholic Church or Australia's history. There are moments that touch on these things, a darkness to this rural town. This is not the best I have seen of this type of thing, the best small simple novel with something dark going on. It is still a really solid example of that, and that is something that I love so much. That means that I did enjoy this book. My Friends by Hisham Mattar follows a Libyan man in London over the course of 40 years. We start with him meeting one of his friends who is moving to America, and this sets him off reminiscing. It is a Proustian tale in that way, one that is centred on and circles round his friends, but it's not really about friendship in any way. The title is slightly misleading in that sense. This is much more of an insular novel that focuses in on our main character. He moved to Edinburgh to study, but became swept up in the political momentum of the 1980s in relation to the Gaddafi regime in Libya and ends up stuck, unable to return to his homeland, separated from his family. This is another novel about grief, and on top of that too, it is a novel about storytelling and about the impossibility of knowing one another. The fact that our understanding of each other all comes from the stories we tell. There are many references in this to translations between Arabic into English. The lie inherent in translation is something that one of his teachers talks about, something that drew him to the studies that he is taking. And this idea that we cannot understand one another is why this is called My Friends. It is what is about his attempting to know people in his lives and his feeling of being unknown and disconnected. A lot of the time, it's a very slow-moving and insular novel that's based inside our main character's head, and his understanding of other people's motives, he does not feel he does, and it leads to certain bizarre moments, but it's so simply told. It is a really beautifully, powerfully written book. There is some stunning language in here, and I think the sense of our main character, his brain, his psychology, the way he thinks, is so strong. And at the very beginning, there is a moment where one of the characters who becomes one of his friends before he knew him has his story read out on the radio. And it is a story of a man who is slowly eaten alive by a cat because he will not rebel. And that passivity, that not being willing to say anything, to say what is going on, permeates throughout the novel. That story sets the tone for the book. But that is not the only story told. And whilst this character is telling us a story and is telling us about his life, we also get moments where other characters tell us their stories. And those layers of tales telling brought to mind a feeling of oral storytelling tradition that I really, really love in books. I think that it was so well done. And this is definitely my winner for the Booker Prize this year.